Sarah Brennan stood at the edge of the church social with a plate of cornbread nobody was taking. She had cut it herself that morning and carried it 2 miles in a basket lined with cloth her mother had given her before the fever took her. The bread was good. She knew that. But she also knew what the women saw when they looked at her table, which was a widow of no particular beauty who had buried a husband after 6 childless months and then stayed on alone in a claim house most sensible women would have left. They took bread from Molly Patterson's table and from the Reverend's wife, and they took it from the German woman, whose name they couldn't pronounce but whose strudel they praised. They did not take Sarah's cornbread, and she did not trouble them about it. She was preparing to carry the plate home untouched when a man she had never seen before walked up to her table, looked at the bread the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for some time, and said, "Ma'am, I wonder if you'd spare a piece of that." She gave him 2 pieces and watched him eat, the first one standing there without ceremony or comment. He was not a young man, maybe 40, with the kind of face weather had worked on until all that was left was the essential shape of it. His coat had been mended more than once, and his boots were good boots that had seen 1,000 miles. When he finished the first piece, he wrapped the second in the cloth she offered and put it in his pocket with a nod that seemed to close some private transaction between them. Then he walked away. She noticed he walked away alone, and that nobody called after him, and that he did not seem to expect they would. His name, she learned later, was Thomas Farrell, and he had hired on at the Hutchins Ranch, doing whatever work a ranch required of a man who showed up without references in the middle of October. He was a drover, or had been, or said he had been when Hutchins asked him. He did not say where he had come from or why he had stopped moving. Hutchins, who was a practical man, did not press him. A man who could handle a horse and mend a fence and keep his mouth shut about other people's business was worth his wages, and if he had a history he was not offering, well, most men did. Sarah Brennan had been Sarah Calhoun before her marriage, and before that she had been the 4th daughter of a tobacco farmer in Missouri who had looked at his prospects and moved west with his wife and 6 children in a wagon that broke an axle outside of Dodge and never got farther. Her father died of something the doctor called his heart, but which Sarah thought was more accurately called the will to continue, and her mother followed him 8 months later. Her sisters married and scattered. Her brothers went north to the rail lines. Sarah stayed because the claim was filed and someone had to hold it, and because she had no particular destination in mind. When Jacob Brennan, who owned the adjoining property, and whose wife had died in childbirth the winter before, asked her to marry him, she said yes. It was not a matter of affection. It was a matter of survival dressed up in a ceremony neither of them wanted, but which the community required. He was not unkind. He was simply used up, and 6 months after the wedding he went to sleep beside her and did not wake. She buried him next to his first wife and the infant daughter he had never named, and she kept the house and the claim and the silence. Thomas Farrell came into town every other Saturday for supplies. She saw him at the dry goods store, and once outside the livery, and a 3rd time at the church social in November, when she brought a dried apple cake that people took this time, though she suspected it was more out of pity than appetite. He did not approach her table. He stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands and left before the Reverend could finish his closing remarks. But she saw him looking at the cake, and she saw the way he looked at it, which was the way a man looks at something he remembers from a long time ago. The snow came early that year, a heavy, wet snow that started in the first week of December and fell for 3 days without pause. On the 4th day, when the sky finally cleared and the cold came down hard enough to freeze the water in the basin on her washstand, she heard someone working on her roof. She went outside and found Thomas Farrell on a ladder, nailing down a section of shingles that had lifted in the wind. He did not greet her. He finished the work, climbed down, and said, "You had a gap. It would have let the weather in. She said, "I didn't ask you to do that." He said, "No, ma'am." She said, "I can't pay you." He said, "Didn't ask you to." She stood there in the cold with her arms crossed over her chest and watched him load the ladder onto the back of a borrowed wagon. Then she said, "You look hungry." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. Something crossed his face, some brief flicker of surprise or recognition, and then it was gone. He said, "I could eat." She made him sit at the table while she fried salt pork and potatoes and reheated the cornbread from 2 days before. He ate without speaking, and she did not ask him questions, and when he was finished he carried his plate to the basin and set it down as gently as if it were made of something that might break. He said, "That was a fine meal, ma'am. I'm obliged." She said, "The roof was a fair trade." He said, "No, ma'am, it wasn't." He left before she could argue the point, and she stood at the window and watched him drive the wagon back toward the Hutchins place, a dark shape against the snow that went on in every direction with nowhere else to be. After that, he came by once a week, sometimes twice. He mended the fence line. He replaced the rotted boards on the porch steps. He cleaned the chimney and restacked the wood pile so it would shed rain. He never announced himself, and he never explained what he was doing. He simply appeared, did the work, and left. She began to expect him the way she expected the seasons, and she began to leave the door unlatched on the days he might come, and she began to cook more than she needed, which he must have noticed, but which neither of them mentioned. The town noticed. Molly Patterson noticed first, because Molly Patterson noticed everything, and considered it her Christian duty to share what she noticed with anyone who would listen. She mentioned it to the Reverend's wife, who mentioned it to the postmaster's wife, who mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to Hutchins. Hutchins, who was not a fool, said that Thomas Farrell was a man who did his work and kept to himself, and if he wanted to fix a widow's roof that was between him and the widow. The postmaster's wife said it did not look proper. Hutchins said he expected it looked like kindness, and the matter was dropped, though not forgotten. In January, Thomas brought her a haunch of venison wrapped in cloth and told her he had been hunting and had more than he needed. She knew this was a lie. She also knew it was the kind of lie a proud man tells when he wants to give something without making the giving a matter of charity. She took the venison and made a stew that lasted her 4 days, and on the 5th day, he came by to replace a broken hinge on the barn door, and she gave him half the stew in a jar he could take back with him. He accepted it with a nod, and she watched him ride off with the jar tucked into his saddlebag, and she thought about the fact that he had been eating an awful lot of her cooking for a man who had claimed to have more venison than he needed. By February, they had arrived at an arrangement neither of them had proposed. He came by every Sunday after church and stayed for dinner. She cooked, and he ate, and they spoke very little, but the silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had both spent enough time alone to know the value of companionship that did not require performance. Once, when she asked him where he had learned to mend a roof, he said he had worked construction in Kansas City before the war. She did not ask which war or why he had left. He did not offer. In March, a man named Carter rode out to her property and told her he was interested in buying her claim. He said it in the way men say things when they expect no argument, and he named a price that was half what the land was worth. She told him the land was not for sale. He said a woman alone could not manage a claim, and that it was only a matter of time before she lost it to weather, or debt, or simple exhaustion. She said she had managed it for 3 years and intended to manage it for 30 more. He said she was being foolish. She said he was trespassing. He did not leave. He stood there on her porch with his hat pushed back on his head and his thumbs hooked in his belt and told her he would come back when she had thought it over and come to her senses. Thomas Farrell arrived an hour later to fix a loose board on the barn door. She told him about Carter. He listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he said, "Do you want the land?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then you'll keep it." Carter came back 2 weeks later. This time Thomas was there, resetting a fence post. Carter looked at him and looked at Sarah and said, "I didn't realize you had help, Mrs. Brennan." Thomas said, "She does." Carter said, "I don't believe we've met." Thomas said, "No." Carter waited for more. Thomas offered nothing. The silence stretched out between them until it became a kind of answer in itself, and Carter, who was not accustomed to being made to feel small by a man who did not even bother to argue with him, said he would be on his way. He did not come back. In April, on a Sunday after church, Thomas stayed later than usual. They sat on the porch and watched the light go long across the valley, and she asked him if he had people somewhere. He said he had a brother in Ohio he had not spoken to in 15 years. She asked him if he missed Ohio. He said he missed the idea of it, which was not the same thing. She did not ask him what he meant. She thought she already knew. In May, he asked her if she had ever thought about planting a garden in the south plot where the light was good. She said she had thought about it, but had not had the time. He said he could turn the soil if she wanted. She said she would like that. He turned the soil and she planted beans and squash and tomatoes, and they worked side by side without speaking. And when the work was done, he washed his hands at the pump, and she brought him a cup of water, and he drank it standing there in the last of the evening light. She thought about the fact that he had not left yet, and that it was later than he usually stayed, and that he was looking at her the way he had looked at the cornbread that first day, which was the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for some time. He said, "Mrs. Brennan, I wonder if you would consider letting me stay on here permanent." She said, "In what capacity?" He said, "As your husband, if you're willing." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them smiled. She said, "I'm willing." He said, "I don't have much to bring you besides work." She said, "Work is enough." They were married by the Reverend in June, with Hutchins and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore the same dress she had worn to marry Jacob Brennan, because it was the only good dress she owned and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Thomas wore a clean shirt and a string tie someone had loaned him. The ceremony was short. Afterward, they went home and she made supper and he ate it. And when the dishes were done, he said, "I'll sleep in the barn until you say otherwise." She said, "You'll sleep in the house. You're my husband." He said, "Yes, ma'am." That night, lying beside him in the dark, she said, "Why did you stay?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were the first person in 10 years who looked at me like I was worth feeding." She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. They worked the claim together for 23 years. He built a second room onto the house and a chicken coop and a smokehouse. She planted an orchard that bore fruit in the 5th year and kept bearing it long after most of the other orchards in the valley had failed. They had no children, which grieved her quietly and which he never mentioned, but they raised a succession of dogs and barn cats, and once a calf that had been abandoned by its mother, and which Thomas fed with a bottle every 4 hours until it was strong enough to stand on its own. The calf lived. People remembered that. The town revised its opinion of them slowly, one sighting adding to the last, until the general consensus was that Thomas Farrell was a steady man who had done well by Sarah Brennan, and that Sarah Brennan was a woman of more substance than anyone had given her credit for. Molly Patterson, who had once suggested the arrangement did not look proper, eventually admitted that she had never seen a marriage that looked more like an actual partnership, and coming from Molly Patterson, who did not give compliments lightly, that was nearly applause. Thomas died in his sleep on a January morning in the 24th year of their marriage. Sarah woke and found him gone, and sat beside him for an hour before she rode into town to tell the Reverend. They buried him next to Jacob Brennan and the unnamed infant, and Sarah stood at the grave with her hands folded and her face dry and did not speak. Hutchins, who had come to pay his respects, said later that he had never seen a woman bear grief with more dignity, and that Thomas Farrell had been lucky to have her, though he suspected Thomas had known that. She lived another 9 years on the claim. She kept the garden and the orchard and the animals, and she took in a young couple who needed a place to start and who worked the land with her until she was too old to do much more than sit on the porch and watch the valley go gold in the evening light. On the day she died, the young wife found a letter on the kitchen table addressed to no one in particular. It said that the claim was to go to them, and that there was a box in the barn with Thomas's few things, and that in the box there was a cloth-wrapped bundle they were to open only after she was gone. They opened it that night. Inside was the cloth she had used to wrap the cornbread at the church social 47 years before, and inside the cloth were 2 pieces of cornbread, dried to the texture of stone, and preserved with the kind of care a man gives to something he means to keep forever. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The young wife, who had heard the story more than once, held the cloth in her hands and understood that Thomas Farrell had carried those pieces of cornbread in his saddlebag for weeks, maybe months, before he ever worked up the courage to speak to the woman who had offered them, and that he had kept them all the years after as a reminder of the day his life had changed direction. She wrapped them back up and put them in a box of her own, and years later, when people asked her about the Farrells, she told them it was a love story, though not the kind you saw coming. It was the kind that built itself one meal at a time, one mended fence at a time, one quiet evening at a time, until the day you looked up and realized you were home and had been for longer than you could remember.